In this section, we'll discuss the dawn of imperialism in American foreign policy and the reason Americans became imperialists during the progressive age from the 1890s into World War I. First, throughout much of the 19th century, the Monroe Doctrine had guided Americans' interaction with much of the world. In 1823, President James Monroe declared that the United States would respond to any further European colonization or efforts to intervene in North, Central, or South America as an act of aggression. America, it implied, was for the Americans. At the same time, the Monroe Doctrine stated that the United States would not meddle or intervene in the affairs of Europe. The U.S. was not particularly strong in the 1820s, but it was an age in which many Latin American countries had begun to declare independence against their old European colonial masters. The European countries largely dismissed the Monroe Doctrine, but it came to define America's foreign policy for much of the 19th century. The United States was only interested in the Western Hemisphere. This sole concern for the Western Hemisphere defined the American policy known as Isolationism. Only in the 1870s and 1880s, after the Civil War, did the first signs of a new sentiment emerge. In the mid-1880s, for example, a quarrel between Great Britain and the United States over fishing rights in the North Atlantic and in the Bering Sea off Alaska reawakened America's latent anti-British feeling. Increasingly, it appeared, Americans were embracing a very nationalist, expansionist policy. The Americans were coming to embrace imperialism, the desire to expand American control, often at the expense of others. A poem published in the Detroit News was adapted from an English music hall song and supplied the nickname that critics would apply to the promoters of expansion, jingoism. We do not want to fight, but by jingo, if we do, we'll scoop up in all the fishing grounds and the whole Dominion too. The fishing rights dispute was resolved in 1898, but by then attention had shifted to Latin America. In 1891, as civil war raged in Chile, American officials seized a Chilean vessel that was attempting to buy guns in San Diego. Soon after, a mob in Valparaiso, Chile, killed 2 unarmed sailors on shore leave. President Harrison practically called for war. Only when Chile apologized and paid an indemnity was the incident closed. Another Latin American conflict arose from a boundary dispute between Venezuela and British Guiana in 1895. The disagreement worsened after gold was discovered in the contested territory. When the British rejected an American arbitration offer and condescendingly insisted that America's revered Monroe Doctrine had no standing in international law, a livid Grover Cleveland asked Congress to set up a commission to settle the disputed boundary even without Britain's approval. As patriotic fervor pulsed through the nation, the British in 1897 accepted the commission's findings. Meanwhile, the American Navy focused on the Samoan Islands in the South Pacific, where it sought access to the port of Pago Pago as a refueling station. Britain and Germany had ambitions in Samoa as well, and in March 1889, the United States and Germany narrowly avoided a naval battle when a hurricane wrecked both fleets. Secretary of State Blaine's wife wrote to one of their children, quote, "Your father's now looking up Samoa on the map." Once he found it, negotiations began, and the United States, Great Britain, and Germany finally established a three-way protectorate, so-called, over the islands. Attention had by that time shifted to the Hawaiian Islands, which had both strategic and economic significance for the Americans. New England trading vessels had been around since the 1790s, and missionaries had come in the 1820s. By the Civil War, American-owned sugar plantations worked by Chinese and Japanese laborers dotted the island. Under an 1887 treaty, negotiated after the planters had forcibly imposed a new constitution on Hawaii's native ruler Kalakaua, the United States built a naval base at Pearl Harbor, near Honolulu. American economic dominance and the influx of foreigners really ticked off the Hawaiians. In 1891, they welcomed Queen Liliuokalani, a strong-willed woman hostile to the Americans, to the Hawaiian throne. Meanwhile, in 1890, the framers of the McKinley Tariff, pressured by domestic sugar growers, eliminated the duty-free status enjoyed by Hawaiian sugar. In January 1893, facing ruin as Hawaii's wholesale sugar prices plunged 40%, the planters deposed Queen Liliuokalani, proclaimed the independent Republic of Hawaii, and requested U.S. annexation. The U.S. State Department's representative in Hawaii cabled Washington, quote, "The Hawaiian pear is now fully ripe, and this is the golden hour for the United States to pluck it. But the grab for Hawaii troubled Cleveland, who sent a representative to investigate the situation. The representative's report questioned whether the Hawaiian people actually wanted annexation. Cleveland's scruples really ticked off expansionists. When McKinley succeeded Cleveland in 1897, the acquisition of Hawaii was pushed forward by sugar companies that had similar investments in Cuba. A number of factors were driving this shift from isolationism to imperialism. Most important was the improvement in transportation and communication attendant to the Industrial Revolution. The world literally seemed smaller. Before, for example, it could take weeks and weeks to cross the Atlantic. Now, with modern steamships, a journey could be accomplished in days. The first transatlantic steamship couldn't carry enough coal, really, or people or supplies to make the journey profitable. So those ships were often hybrid with sails as well as steam boilers. By the 1870s, better propeller designs and more efficient boilers meant less coal necessary, and the ocean crossings were quicker and, all under steam power. The White Star Line began offering new amenities to go with the higher efficiency, and, the size of the ships grew. In 1912, perhaps one of the most famous ship disasters ever, the largest steamship ever built, the Titanic, sank on its maiden voyage after it hit an iceberg. Also, in 1858, the first transatlantic telegraph cable was put in use across the floor of the Atlantic from Newfoundland, Canada to Ireland. Newer cables followed in the 1860s, all the way pretty much to the 1890s, each time speeding up communications. It meant faster transmissions. In 1886, wireless telegraphy was developed, the ability to send Morse codes by radio waves. New ships could now all communicate easier. The point is that with better transportation communication, it was easier to do business abroad or to affect what happened abroad. News spread faster. When it was easy to, it was kind of easy to be isolationist because the Americans were in a sense truly isolated. They were far from other lands, often too far from many businesses to be practical and profitable. Now, however, there was more international commerce. As only one example, America's new automobile industry led to a need for rubber in the production of tires. With rubber only grown in more temperate climates such as Brazil and Asia, suddenly what happened there was critical to American business. With America's large new corporations, their interest growing abroad, both in terms of finding new raw materials needed and securing markets for their mass-produced goods they made, the American government soon got involved to protect the business interest abroad. It should be noted that America in the late 19th century wasn't the only country embracing imperialism. In a sense, the dawn of the 20th century was an imperialist age. The modern industrialized countries of Europe and Asia were all competing for control of the mineral-rich, non-industrialized, non-developed countries. In this period, Europeans were colonizing Africa and Southeast Asia. There's a mercantilistic sense that the amount of wealth in the world was limited, and if America didn't get in and get its own cut, then its own markets and its own raw materials, and its competing countries would gain them, and America would be weaker by comparison. Of course, the closing of the West contributed to the new imperialism as well. Before, we could afford to ignore the rest of the world because, hey, we were busy growing across the North American continent. Remember Frederick Jackson Turner? The frontier was a constant source of new raw materials. Well, heck, that frontier was closed, and many Americans thought if we didn't continue to physically expand, we wouldn't grow economically. There was also a sense growing from manifest destiny of America's exceptionalism. Hey, America was a land of freedom and democracy, and in a sense, we saw the spread of American hegemony, American control. It's good for the world. There was a bit of social Darwinism tinged in it. The U.S. was simply better and a more advanced society, and having us spread, well, heck, that was natural progression. Finally, race and religion played a role in imperialist drive. Religious leaders proclaimed America's mission to spread Christianity, and at times that had a racist tinge. Most of the countries that America conquered and colonized were, of course, non-white, either African or Asian, and non-Christian, and most Americans regarded them as in need of being saved, in a sense inferior. This concludes the section defining imperialism and talking about why it grew.